All right. Welcome, everybody, to the final Giants eighth grade rollout of the 2023-24 school year. It is April 17th. It is our last night of Giants, and we are here today to go over count them, two different units. Phil and I had a lot of fun running these, and even though our numbers may have been small, that happened last time too. Eighth grade teachers went the longest without any of the free resources like Giants or MC3. And so, we sort of expected that a lot of folks were going to have their needs covered already, and that is totally fine. We're still here tonight, going through and rolling out basically two units. We're going to be rolling out the remainder of Unit 6 on the Civil War tonight, and then we're going to move over to Unit 7 on Reconstruction. And at that point, we'll be done. And when it comes to what's left from Unit 6, last time, we focused solely on lesson one, and we did that primarily because we wanted to roll out things that might show up on the M step as early as possible. But these nights are already jam packed, so tonight's overview is going to be embedded and slightly less involved than normal, primarily because we already introduced the compelling and supporting questions last time. To recap, our compelling question for this unit is, can you win a civil war? And as we start today with a look at lesson two supporting question, what were the advantages and disadvantages of the North and South at the beginning of the Civil War? I bring you a unit from my undergrad. That's right. When I was completing my undergraduate degree, I had to write a unit plan, and I did this really cool activity. It was actually a throwaway activity. I was kind of like, oh, I have to tick the box for bodily kinesthetic movement because you had to throw in every single one of those educational philosophers somewhere in your unit plan. Because as teachers, we all have time to do that on a regular basis, right? We're all like, oh, now I need to run this lesson through Gardner, and now I need to run this lesson through Piaget, and now I need to run this lesson through. No, we don't have time. It's a great kinesthetic activity to get kids up and moving a bit. And I did it every year, and I finally formalized it for you in these units. So we will go over that briefly tonight. Lesson two also includes a solid dose of Phil, so you'll get him a little bit more tonight than you did at the last network. And we have a slew of activities, both review from previous units that are worth re-mentioning here and new, and more on that in a second. We will also guide you through the Emancipation Proclamation and provide a document study, both for the proclamation itself and the Gettysburg Address. We'll talk about two watershed moments in this era of history. And one thing you won't see in lesson two that very often frustrates eighth grade teachers is we are not giving you in the Giants units a blow by blow study of every major battle in the Civil War. Doing this is sort of a futile practice because our content expectations don't center on all the battles. Our content expectations really center on societal change and reaction to that change. We do, however, provide you a very nice John Green crash course video that covers every major battle of the Civil War in 10 minutes. And that video is great on a variety of fronts because if you're expecting to see all the battles, there it is, or there they are, I should say. And it also helps illustrate the futility of trying to focus in on every battle versus the broader brush that we're trying to paint with here. So lesson three then of unit 6 will bring in the study of the Civil War to a close. It'll focus in on the last moments of the war. We'll get a little into the effects on society and people here. Um, We'll close with some of Ken Burns's incredible documentary, The Civil War. I remember in eighth grade when that came out, we all descended upon our middle school was a middle school concept. And we descended upon two different teachers' classrooms, and they had those removable walls that separated them. And we opened them up, and the entire eighth grade team went in and we watched the Civil War all day to cap off our study of the war. And even as an eighth grade boy who didn't love history at the time, I was just instantly transported by and transfixed by Ken Burns' storytelling prowess. And I loved seeing it all unfold. So bring as much of the Civil War into it as you would like to in your study of the Civil War, because it's all good. Um, We'll also talk about Unit 7 a little bit later tonight, but I'm not going to roll that over now. Now, according to our agenda, I'm going to turn things over to Phil for a brief piece on some of the big legislative pieces that we'll be encountering in this unit. So, Phil, take away big legislative pieces.
And it seems like a very odd title to put up here, except for what was going on legislatively for about 20 years before the Civil War. And that is a general discussion about what do we do with the Northwest Territory? What do we do with the Louisiana Purchase? What do we do with all this new land that has become part of the country here? Now, I'm not going to be talking about different ways of dividing land, but there is a handout in your packet on the website that shows that different cultures coming from Europe divided land in different ways. It still sits around as a kind of a menace to drivers in different places. The fact that Boston is laid out differently from New Orleans, it's laid out differently from Omaha, and that has to do with the way the land was divided by these different people. And it was precisely because there was that confusion that Thomas Jefferson had pushed very hard during the Northwest Ordinance time to say you should survey the land with an unambiguous way before you let settlers claim or buy it. And again, there's a handout in your packet about how the public land survey was designed. I won't be talking about that very much right now, because I want to go to the next step of what the Northwest Ordinance did. And that is it authorized a number of different kinds of land grants, direct transfers of land to private owners. You know that 2 out of every 36 sections in a township, 1/18 of the township was set aside to support the local schools. That turned out to be 78 million acres of land. Road building, there were some very specific grants for things like the National Road going west from Washington, D.C. Canal building was a whole lot less organized. Different places in the country asked for canal grants. Michigan even got a couple of them to start a canal going from Detroit to Kalamazoo. And there were canal grants in about 15 different states. Railroad building, it says 37 million acres. This is before the Railroad Act and the transcontinental railroads. These were little bitty railroads scattered all over Michigan and Ohio and Illinois and Indiana. Surprisingly, the South didn't get very many of those. That's going to play into the Civil War. And then finally, the second biggest grant of land was to pay off the soldiers who had fought during the Revolution and the War of 1812 and the action against the Barbary pirates and all the other military things that we had been doing. What Congress could not decide what to do, that was all about the Northwest Ordinance. What Congress could not decide was how to transfer the land of the Louisiana Purchase. Northern congressmen wanted to make it easy for small farmers to get free land, and they've been pushing some kind of Homestead Act as early as 1830. Southern congressmen, however, wanted to oppose any measure that would make it harder for people to claim large plantations, because they knew if we wound up with a whole bunch of small farmers out there, we were going to have too many voters against slavery, and eventually that was going to be a problem. And this was deadlocked for decades. And then came the Civil War. And all of a sudden, Lincoln had a Congress that didn't have any Southern congressmen in it, and it was easy to persuade them to pass 3 laws. These were laws, however, that had been carefully crafted over decades. And they are very far-reaching laws. They are globally unique. The Homestead Act gave away about 290 million acres of land, a huge piece of real estate. And it was given away essentially free to settlers who would go out there. The Railroad Act provided 90 million acres for 5 different railroads. Your clickable map of the US actually has a map of those railroad land grants and who got them and who didn't. Notice Oklahoma is missing because that was Indian land at the time, and we didn't want to give any railroads to the anyway. The railroad grants were designed like a chessboard, with the railroad companies getting all of the odd numbered sections, which they could then sell in order to get the money that they wanted to build the railroads. And then sections 16 and 36, 2 even-numbered ones, were set aside for the schools and the colleges. That's going to come back to haunt us in a little while. The third act, which I just mentioned, was the Moral College Act. That offered free land in addition to the section land for support colleges like Michigan State. Now, most of Michigan State's land was inside of Michigan, but the states in the East that already had most of their land in private hands wanted in on the bounty anyway. So MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, actually was given land in 11 different states, which they then sold and used to build up their endowment to pay off some of their debt. And then over the next century, Congress kept doing the same thing. They made land grants to veterans of the Civil War, to loggers, to miners, to irrigators, to ranchers. Another 110 million acres. Now, last time we gave you this handout saying these are some of the major land grant programs. And we mentioned last time the big historic consequence is that the United States has run a budget deficit since the Revolution, but they've been able to hide that deficit by using stolen land to pay for things like soldier schools, railroads, canals, roads, irrigation projects, mines, all of these other things that people wanted, but they didn't want to pay the tax for. And we mentioned last time, that come the middle of the 20th century, FDR didn't exactly invent deficit spending. What he did was run out of land. And when he didn't have any more land to pay for it, then he had to start raising taxes. And we got things like the income tax. I said, this is a pretty important context, partly because of where it happened, partly because of when it happened. Because this happened during the Civil War, and therefore the effects of almost all of these land grants were preferentially aimed to support people from the North and not to spread throughout. So the geographic result, we've been talking about the historic result and the economic result. The geographic result was to create a kind of a nightmare of public land and private owners. You're looking at a map of a section near Palm Springs, California, and some of the land is owned by the purple land by the National Park Service, the yellow land by the Bureau of Land Management, the green land by the United States Forest Service, the orange land by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The blue land is owned by the state government. And I know this area because I have personally camped on my pickup truck on every colored land on that map. And it did it as part of the research project, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later on. So here's a sample map out of the West. This is Colorado, and you notice Colorado is kind of divided in half. In the eastern part is the part that you basically just have the blue school sections that were transferred to the state or the local government to pay for the schools. The western half of Colorado is an absolute nightmare of different land ownerships, often with alternate sections in that checkerboard arrangement. Now, if you happen to be near Beatrice, Nebraska, there is a Homestead National Monument that is definitely worth going to. And if not, go out to their website and look at the virtual tour of it. The fence that's in the front of the thing has got every state with a box cut out of it to say how much of that state land was given away free as part of the Homestead Act. Inside, there's all kinds of typical museum exhibits. There's old photographs, there's graphs, there's posters that were made at the time. There's one wonderful graph. Michigan got 19 million acres. Minnesota got 85,000 homesteads. Montana, 150,000 homesteads. This is a big chunk of Montana that was given away. And if you are so inclined, there's a computer in there that lets you dial in your grandparents' name. My grandparents were the Richters, and you could find out where all of their homesteads were claimed. Outside, there's an old homestead cabin that you can look at. I think some of these numbers are worth paying attention. This cabin was 14 by 16 feet because there just weren't very many trees around to build things with. 14 by 16 feet with two adults and 10 children living in it. As one teacher told me, they were stacked up like cordwood inside at night. And then a final bridge on the PowerPoint that I'm giving you guys, and then I'll go into a personal anecdote. This is a bridge on the Transcontinental Railroad. And I want you to take a look at that and think about how willing you would be to ride the train over that thing. Because the railroad companies got a fixed amount of land for every mile of track they built. So they didn't want to spend any more for construction than they had to. And one of the results of that was to create a whole lot of bridges that were. Do we have that problem today, by the way? Have we had any bridges lately that were not built solidly enough for the environment in which they were located? In any case, that's a picture that you can leave your students with. Then let me give you, for about the last 4 minutes that I've got, a personal story about the land survey. This is the part of Wyoming. The white land is privately owned. The yellow land is Bureau of Land Management. The blue land is the state land, the school sections. It's an area of very high elevation and very long slopes, a 15-mile downhill run here. Where it's a little bit steeper, you get these runaway truck ramps, piled up with gravel, so the truck goes up there and sinks up in the wheel hubs and slows down. Near the summits, it gets too cold for trees to grow, which is why I was up in that particular place. And remember, it's a mix of public and private land, which often leads to very sharp changes in land use. Depending on that, in the background, you can see public national forest land. We had a campsite up near Timberline, carefully designed so the rising sun would serve as our alarm clock. And we were analyzing the pollen record in a small area of peat over here above Timberline like that. We had to hike up to it with the sampling equipment in the backpack. This was to provide a proxy record for the past climate. And you're wondering, what does this possibly have to do with the history discussion about these land laws? The amount of snow up in the mountains is a very good predictor of the size of the streams. And the streams, when they flow downhill and get to a low enough elevation where it gets warm enough, are then used to irrigate the land out there. This was all the way back with those land laws. Remember, some of those land laws provided grants for people doing irrigation systems like this. And you say, what does this possibly have to do with it? It is a system that is ecologically connected, hydrologically, but it is divided up according to its land ownership. And that got to be a real obvious problem when we were going home from back to the University of Wyoming, where I was teaching at the time. We were going back to the University of Wyoming and we saw smoke, and we say, oh, great. Where there's smoke, there's fire. Where there's fire, we can go have some fun. And we went down and asked the people at the Forest Service whether we could have permission to go in the fire line. And to make a long story short, we actually got appointed to the rehab team, to the rehabilitation team. And they were giving us $500 a day plus a helicopter. And our job was simply to go around and check to see whether erosion was too serious on some of the fire lines here. And by the way, this is one of these weird little fire lines. The fire was a typical Western fire. It was really hot in some places, burned just about everything. And in other places, it was kind of patchy. It would go according to the terrain, according to the soil moisture, going up according to the slope. And now the dilemma. This is a system just like the water system, where the water flows downhill. It's formed in one place with snow and it's used in another place for irrigation. Here's a fire that is raging across the landscape, and the law of the land says you have to put this fire out on private land. But once it gets to one of the yellow, blue, or green squares, you have to let the fire burn because we don't want too much fuel to accumulate to make the next fire hotter. Uh, like I say, we made some laws in the 1860s that we couldn't pass in the 1840s. They transferred huge amounts of land to private owners, to railroads, to mining companies, to irrigating, and so on. And they're sitting out there with a land ownership pattern that is creating all kinds of problems hydrologically, geologically, for mining companies, and for wildfires when they break out. Like I say, our job with these maps was to kind of put together what was happening in the mid 1800s and how it affects our lives today. Then, with that, I can pass this back to Dave.
Excellent. Thanks, Phil. Um, so I'm going to go share my screen now because we are just going to keep passing this baton over and over and over again. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this particular activity, but I did want you to know that there is some prep involved for it. So, really, I liked to get into the swing of things. I like to make it look like I am, Abraham Lincoln in particular as part of this. So, build yourself a little cardboard or construction paper pipette. Walk down to the elementary if you need to and grab some of those supplies if it doesn't exist in your classroom. But you're also going to need some cardboard to build these signs. And you can make them as fancy or as not fancy as you like. Last time we did the Giants rollout, I actually raffled them off as a prize. I spent a lot of time in my office building all of those, and one lucky participant, we were in person then, so we could do it. One lucky participant took home all of my signs, which didn't just have the names on them, they also had little graphics as well. Um, I think I was in my adaptive schools phase, so I was practicing drawing little things on agendas anyway. But you need a cardboard sign that talks about shipyards, and then one that says railroads, and one that talks about developed industry and trained officers and food production and armories and resourcefulness. A big resourcefulness sign and a small resourcefulness sign, because that's a little hint. That's something both sides had to different degrees. And then a sign that said a defensive war. You also need some blindfolds for this. I used old ties at the time. My dad had died my dad was close to passing when I was doing this, and he was giving away things. And then I kept those ties in my classroom afterwards. So I used old ties as the blindfolds for students in this, and then a box of candy or other treats. And then We walk you through what you do in this and why you need all of these signs and why you need the blindfolds. But the last piece that I am going to talk about with this before I just very, very quickly go through the different steps, we tried to give you a conversion guide in here. So if you've got a class size of 31, which believe it or not, I had class sizes higher than that my last couple of years of teaching in particular. 22 of those students are going to be the North, nine of them are going to represent the South, and three of them are going to represent slaves. So, depending on the size of your class, anywhere between 20 and 31, we've got your back with this conversion chart that shows how many students you need in each avenue. And then we have you break the kids up based off of whether they're the North, the South, or slaves. Um, and then through each of those signs, you're going to hold up the signs and you're going to ask students a question and then you're going to have them do something. So, this is a movement based activity. It's gone really, really well in classrooms. The feedback I've gotten on the steps here is it's very clear and concise. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all of these because the directions are allegedly very clear and concise. But ultimately, this takes about 20-25 minutes to do in your class, and it's a great way to get your kids up and moving while both reviewing and learning about the various advantages and disadvantages of the North and the South. So, definitely take a look at chess. Definitely build some time to do chess. It's a great activity, maybe even during testing season. This could be a great way to sort of break the monotony of the day and still do some learning. So, that is chess in a nutshell. And then we also have, oh, like you've never messed up what you're saying, Phil. Just kidding. A nutshell. We then get into the Gettysburg Address, and we've got a document study. And in previous units, we outlined some reading strategies, and you can choose to use any one of those reading strategies in here, or bring some of your own to the table. I really like a talk to the text for this one. To a certain degree, the speech is typical politics. It is set 100 plus years before now. The speech itself was brief, and at the time, it was not well received by many people. But there's an old saying that hindsight is 2020, and today, it is recognized as one of the greatest speeches of all time. So Lincoln underscored that the nation itself was built on the idea that all men were created equal. That's represented here in this final line in particular. The final line is that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth is pretty memorable. It calls back to the core values of the American nation. So have students read this. It's not a very long speech. Have students read it, talk to the text with the Gettysburg Address, and then discuss their thoughts about the document. Whole class. So I am not going to share the John Green video that appears here, that appears at the end of lesson two, primarily because, last time we did something like that, Phil and I spent a portion of the summer dealing with a copyright takedown notice, even though the authors gave us permission to do it. So, good old YouTube scans things, and there's plenty of illegal movies uploaded that they seem to keep up there, but good old free curriculum projects get dinged every time. So, not going to show the John Green video that I referenced before on the battles of the Civil War, but please remember that we have it, especially if you're looking for that blow by blow of every single battle that was fought there. It is a fun slog that again underscores the futility of trying to teach all the battles. It's not in your content, folks, so don't worry about it. I'm not saying don't teach all the battles because, there are certain battles that we definitely do get into as part of this, but they're the big important ones. We don't need to know about the Battle of Sarah Harper's backyard or, I'm making these things up now, but we don't need to know about those little skirmishes. We do need to know about bigger ones. So just keep that in mind as part of the John Green crash course if you choose to show it with your kids. We also have we provide you a text of a very interesting letter that was sent to Abraham Lincoln. It was sent to him by a freed slave who was born into slavery in August of 1838 in North Carolina. And this particular person, served in the Union Army. He was at a very young age. He got his freedom. He was purchased by Mr. James N. Gooding, who may have also been his father. There's some speculation there. Um, and this letter does a really good job of showing what many Black soldiers were fighting for. So at this point now, we're about 5 minutes behind schedule, but that is totally fine because I know exactly where to pick this up. At this point, now that I have done both Chess and Gettysburg and the letter to Lincoln, turning things back over to Phil to talk a little bit about Harper's Ferry and why the South lost the Civil War. So, Philip, it's back to you, my friend. I will stop sharing.
Harper's Ferry. Um, Not really about the battles of Harper's Ferry, although there were a lot of them. It's about where Harper's Ferry is and why that rare gap through a long mountain close to Washington, D.C. had so much prominence and eventually became where a guy named John Brown went literally to martyr himself. And he knew there was no way he was going to get out of that alive when he went into that. So, what's going on in Harper's Ferry? It's a great river crossing. It's a terrible place to build a fort. Now, here's the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. There's the Capitol and the Washington Monument. Um, the river is deep here with a soft and muddy bottom. Even today, there's only 8 bridges for a long stretch of this river, and 4 of them are for interstate highways. Um, Bridge building is hard, and by the way, George Washington never threw a silver dollar across the Potomac. It's 10 football fields across. Um, if you go a short distance upstream, you hit that fall zone, and the Potomac River goes over some really hard rocks in a place called Great Falls. This is also a place where it's almost impossible to cross the river. Go another stretch upstream, and you've got an area of nice flat rocks, perfectly straight. This is a great place to cross the river. It's such a great place to cross the river that starting in 1761, a guy named Harper ran a business. And the business was real simple. You want to cross the river? Tie your wagon onto my rope. I'll pull you across. Pay me $1. Um, that is Harper's Ferry. When you look at a close-in topographic map of Harper's Ferry, you can see all those blue squiggles in there. Those are those shallow areas where it's possible to cross the river. You say, well, why would that be particularly important, early on in colonial times? It wasn't. Harper's Ferry, was basically a place to cross the river. Until you take a look at why the river was so narrow in that particular place. These brown lines are contour lines. Each one indicates a specific elevation, and they're like stairs. If they're real close together, that's a really steep slope. There is a handout packet, and the handout packet has maps of Harper's Ferry, and it's got information about contour lines, and it's got a small contour line activity for students. I'm going to trust that that's self-explanatory, and I'm going to back up a little bit and take a look at a bigger map to show where Harper's Ferry is, where the Potomac River cuts through this long ridge. So those are the ridges, and there's the river cutting through there. This is the Shenandoah branch of it, and the Potomac branch, and going out through these 2 ridges here. That's the geography of Harper's Ferry. The ridges are part of a very complicated system of long mountain ranges. They're basically the crumpled bumpers of that continental collision when North America crashed into Africa at about 10 centimeters a year. You can get the details in a science lesson about plate tectonics, and it would give you a good website for those details if you want to connect that with the science to it. But one of the results is flat-lying layers of rock were tipped up on end. Sometimes they point almost straight up. And wherever those tilted rock layers have a river crossing them, there's likely to be a shallow area with a rapids in it. Um, that rapids had two effects. One was it made the river easy to cross there. The other thing is it made the river impossible to navigate through there. You can't run a boat up through that, at least not a barge full of grain or something like that. You might be able to run a canoe through this one. If we back up a little bit further and take a look at a much larger area, you can see that Harpers Ferry is the only gap through a ridge that is almost 60 miles long. And that shows up to be pretty important during Civil War times because Washington, D.C. was right here. The Potomac River goes up, and Robert E. Lee's army was in the Shenandoah Valley on the other side of that long ridge. Now, soldiers can climb up over that ridge, you know. It made Harpers Ferry an important location because of the difference between a soldier and a cannon. A soldier can probably walk up this hill. There is no way that you can drag a 1,000-pound cannon and a wagon full of, what do we say, flour and cannonballs. It's a whole lot easier to travel on a road or a railroad that goes through that gap, and there was a railroad through that gap at the time of the Civil War. That meant controlling that railroad was a critical thing during the Civil War. The handout map that's in the packet there makes it very easy to see the land around the town, and it's got a little activity about where would be the best place to put a fort if you wanted to defend us. It's an obviously important transportation connection, but is it possible to defend this town? As I said, the town of Harpers Ferry is surrounded by pretty rugged hills, way too steep to pull a wagon up. A trail, though, lets you walk right up that hill. You know, even when I'm 60 years old. And when you get to the top of the hill, you get a spectacular view of those shallow areas where the river is cutting through these hard rocks. So there's the town of Harpers Ferry. That's actually the place where John Brown holed up at the end of his little there. Here's the railroad bridge coming along here and going up along that gap there. And a sniper up here could make life absolutely miserable down there. But the hilltop is really small. You probably can't put more than about 75 people on the top of the hill. And you know it's too steep to climb with cannons and wagons and all that kind of thing. But other soldiers could really easily sneak up on a handful of snipers up there. As one Civil War soldier wrote in his diary, General Jackson and General Hill told me personally that they would rather try to capture Harpers Ferry 40 times than to try to defend it once. And in fact, it was attacked about 15 times and it was captured 8 times over the course of the Civil War. But once you got it, you've got to try to defend it, and that turned out not to be possible. Most of the battles, however, were not actually in Harpers Ferry. They took place on the flatter land up here. For example, that town is called Sharpsburg, and that creek is called Antietam, because Antietam and Sharpsburg were not battles just out somewhere. They were battles for control of Harpers Ferry. And well, let me back up. We know Antietam was one of the deadliest single battles in the history of the United States. If we back up this map a little bit farther and look for the next best place to cross the mountains, if you can't win Harpers Ferry, but you want to get across the mountains so that you can attack Washington, P.S. This map was actually made in 1862, right in the middle of the war. So there's Washington, D.C. There's the Potomac River running through there. There's the Long Ridge, those steep, rugged mountains like that. There's Harper's Ferry, the gap through the mountains. There's Antietam, fought for control of Harper's Ferry. The next time the Southern Army came up, it said, we're not even going to try to win Harper's Ferry and keep it. We're going to go for the next gap. So there's the next gap through the mountains. And when I get up there, if I go through that low area, I come out near a little town called Gettysburg. And the biggest battle of the South was at Chattanooga, where the Tennessee River cuts through that long mountain range, because there is no gap between Harper's Ferry and Chattanooga where you can go through that mountain very easily like that. So we're not saying take a look at the, all of the battles of the Civil War. We're saying take a look at the important battles, and nearly all of the important battles were fought for control of the low places where you could get through the mountain range, not just with your soldiers, but with your wagons full of ammunition and your cannons and all the other equipment that you needed in order to fight a war at the time. In the case of Chattanooga, a long road did make it possible to move a cannon up on the top of the mountain. But it's small and hard to defend, and 10,000 Union soldiers pushed 8,000 Confederates off the mountain. That probably was as important as Vicksburg and Gettysburg as a battle to tip the tipping point in the war. So Harper's Ferry is located in a very important gap where river cuts through a very long mountain range. Gettysburg is located in the next gap up. But each of these places, as they turned out to be easy to attack and almost impossible to defend. So that's the story about that. Now, today, with helicopters and drones and so on, places like Harper's Ferry are not really important. Really? I mean, Kabul, Afghanistan turns out to be a location that's almost identical to Harper's Ferry, where a river cuts through a long mountain range. Now, that's the particular topic of the pair that I'm supposed to talk about. Then becomes the general topic, and this is just a collection of maps that you can use in however way you want. So the Harper's Ferry story was a story. This collection of maps you can rearrange in all kinds of different ways. They're maps of conditions before the war. And the question is, why did the South lose the war? One goal of this whole class is for us to keep trying to put together a chain of cause and effect that leads to the Civil War and beyond. So we started out by having you draw 4 lines to divide North America into regions. This is way back in September. And the Southeast is defined as the region that has enough rain to grow trees and at least half of the year above freezing. And then we asked the question, how come if the South is like that, it grew so slowly compared to the other parts? Because that had effects on economic wealth, clout, and military might. One of the arguments that we made, and again, this is reviewing previous, is that that line is also the line of a particular kind of soil called an ultrasol, the soil that forms where you've got at least 7 months with no frost and plenty of rain. And we said that particular kind of soil tends to be much less productive for most of the food crops. So that's reason number one the South lost the war, is it could barely feed itself. In fact, one of the reasons that Robert E. Lee took an army up that Shenandoah Valley up into Pennsylvania was to steal food from Pennsylvania farmers. You know, he wanted to get to a place where he could live off the land. Then we said cotton is unique because it requires 200 days without frost. So there wasn't any choice. It had to be grown in that hot and rainy region. And we gave you something about how much more effort it takes to grow cotton, which is one of the reasons why the South wanted to have slavery as an institution, is the economy of the South just simply required a great deal more labor. A student activity, however, leads to the conclusion that the plantation economy was actually dominant in just a small fraction of the Sea Islands of South Carolina, the Black Belt of Alabama, and the Mississippi River Valley. And it talked about where the cotton was growing and why this was indigo and rice, and so on. This led to the forced migration of nearly 1 million African slaves moving out westward like that. So we've got long growing season, creating a soil that makes it hard to grow food, but makes it the only place where you could grow cotton. Then in the last time, we also mentioned yellow fever and hookworms as possible contributors to why the South lost the war. In fact, one of the medics at the time said a third of the Southern soldiers were not able to run up the hill at Gettysburg because of the disease load that they had within them. Now, I'm not sure whether that is a scientific conclusion, but the South did have a notably higher death rate and a notably lower productivity than the Northern region. These diseases added to a fourth reason why the South lost, and that is the North had been growing much faster through a lower death rate and through higher immigration. So that just Ohio and Indiana and Illinois had more population growth than the entire South during the 1830s. And the North therefore had 3 times as many railroad miles, 10 times as many factory workers as the South. Last time we gave you this map just right at the end and said, reason number 5 the South lost the war is that inside of nearly every state of the South, there was guerrilla armies that were fighting on the side of the Union. And that meant that the South had to keep some of their soldiers at home just to keep their neighbors from attacking them. Which leads to the 6th reason, and probably the most important reason, is that South slave owners rightly feared a slave revolt. And they wound up having to keep a lot of weapons and a lot of troops at home in order to control the slaves. And they needed the slaves to continue in order to get the cotton that they were trying to sell on the black market through New Orleans and Mobile and places like that, trying to run the blockade. So 4 million people of African origin, half of the population of the South. That's a long list of things that happened before we even begin to start talking about military strategy and brilliant generals and all of the stuff that historians like to talk about. That there were 6 really good environmental reasons that led to a lower population with less productivity that had to keep a certain number of their soldiers at home to control the slave population. And all of that adding up to a just much weaker environment, a much weaker population in a contest where the number of people and their ability to produce helped to determine the outcome. Was that awful? That should bring us up to just barely 15 minutes, 5 minutes late on the break time.
All right. Well, we are going to take our 5 minute break now, and we will be back at 5:25 p.m. All right, we are back from our break. Thank you, everybody. And we've got a couple of things here. We're going to really get into our overview now of Unit 7. So, to do that, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen because Phil and I are playing the most impressive game of Zoom ping pong we have ever played in our Zoom rollouts since we started doing them all virtually. Um, Tonight's a good night. So here we are. We have our compelling question for Unit 7. It is the can a nation rebuild after fighting itself? And we have talked for a long time about this being a very historic period of time for the United States, and being the culmination of this can kick that we've seen all year. And so in this final unit, we're now into what comes after it. And in this particular case, we're going to look at how the nation tried to come back together after the war ended. Now, I say tried because historians can debate until the cows come home whether or not we actually did rebuild and reunite after coming back together, and then the cows can come back home and we can ask them for their opinions as well. But for the most part, I think that definitively the war ended, the battles ended, and definitively we came together and tried to come back. But there's still some cans that kick down the road into the non-existent high school U.S. history giants course, that you'll definitely study when your students will definitely study when they get to high school. So we ask students to begin right off the bat by asking how they think a nation can come back together and rebuild after fighting itself. And then we give you yet another John Green crash course video. This particular one is an overview on Reconstruction. Now, we provide this one here for a variety of reasons. One of the biggest being a lot of teachers don't get to do Reconstruction justice. By the time it comes in at the end of the school year, everything else has happened, and there's oftentimes not a lot of time left over. So we give you this John Green video so that you can at least do your due diligence and say, hey, you know what? We attempted to do Reconstruction, and kids got at least 10 minutes of instruction on Reconstruction. They'll get a lot more than that, ideally, but especially since most people have to slow John Green down, it'll be more like 15 minutes of instruction. But so we have this here just to sort of ground kids in what to expect as they go through the course of this unit. And again, to help pick up some speed if you have to cut some things because it's the 1st of June and your kids are out on the 4th. So we talk a little bit about the competing views on Reconstruction. Go figure, it's hard to believe given how well we all agree on everything today in 2024. But, there were some different viewpoints on how the country should come back together. So we talk a little bit about this in the overview presentation and we dig a little deeper into it, through the course of the units. But you have Lincoln who begins it, and then he's assassinated, and then his vice president, Andrew Johnson, took over. And even those two had some vastly different views about their ideas on how to bring the nation back together. Now, Lincoln was a Republican and Johnson was a Democrat, and he won on that ticket in order to keep the border states happy. But the border states don't necessarily have the same thoughts and ideas as the North, and the North definitely doesn't have the same ideals as the South. So all of this set up some interesting conflict, particularly between these two men. So, Lincoln, what did he want? He wanted the war to end quickly. He feared a prolonged war. He didn't want to punish Southerners or completely reorganize Southern society. He wanted Reconstruction to be a relatively short process. He had a 10% plan. Once 10% of the voters in a state swore an oath of allegiance to the Union, that state could be allowed back in. Voters could draft revised state constitutions and establish state governments again. This is what he wanted, and he got parts of it. But Johnson also rejected all Republican attempts to dissolve the plantation system and completely reorganize the South. Again, if he's representing the interest of the border states, that sort of tracks, that makes sense. He was also against protecting the civil rights of African Americans. He returned a lot of confiscated property. He issued hundreds upon hundreds of pardons to former Confederate officials, government officials. Um, he did everything he could to undermine some of the initiatives that were put into place to help onboard basically newly freed slaves into the Union. And he appointed some governors to supervise the drafting of states' constitutions that, you know, basically he tried his best to undermine a lot of the process. Despite these two different philosophies, African Americans did gain many new rights and freedoms that they didn't have during this era, but then there were lots of groups that were still working against them, even with those rights. And we talk a little bit about them in this unit as well. In terms of the major goals of Reconstruction, we like to talk about freedmen bureaus and how they helped newly freed African Americans adjust to life away from slavery. Um, I have a family member who, grew up in the Deep South most of her childhood, and she is just old enough that she tells the stories of after she would go to church on Sunday, she would come back. She would go to the park, and there was an elderly African American gentleman who had lived through slavery and lived through emancipation. And the story that she likes to tell is that this man talked about how well he was treated on his plantation, and how well his family treated him, and how after the state was readmitted to the Union and slaves were freed, his life changed and things weren't quite as good. And I liked to tell this family member every time they would tell the story, they may have been treated well as a slave, but they were still slaves. They didn't have these rights. They didn't have, it wasn't until afterwards, yes, their life definitely would have been hard, because despite gaining all these rights, there were also all sorts of forces working against them. So I always have to remind this family member that, it was not necessarily a good thing that they were slaves. They were slaves, flat out, plain and simple. Does not matter that they were treated well allegedly by by the people who own them. Humans owning other humans is morally reprehensible, and this family member doesn't always like it when I bring that up, but in turn, they did gain many new rights and freedoms that did not exist to them before. So we had a Civil Rights Act passed, and it was vetoed by Johnson, but Congress overrode that veto. We had three new amendments to the Constitution introduced and ratified, and we talked about them. African Americans joining politics. We've got a project in this unit centered around that. Lots of really good things, but lots of really bad things as well. So, in terms of new legislation, we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. If you flash back to the December rollout, I talked about how a Constitution unit is a great time to introduce the Bill of Rights and the first three amendments following the Bill of Rights, and the amendments following the Bill of Rights, particularly 13, 14, and 15, because 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment often pop up on the M step. So reviewing those earlier in the year is good. And even if you did those earlier in the year, you're going to review them in this unit. So we spend a little time there. We also get into new legislation that's passed, and how some of those constitutional amendments impacted Reconstruction. So we end up with the Black Codes, we end up with Jim Crow laws, the KKK arises, all in this area, or all in this era. So not all hugs and puppy dogs here. Um, we then talk about why Reconstruction ended before achieving all of its goals. We talk about the presidential election in 1876 and who it came down to. And there was this compromise that was reached, and Reconstruction sort of ended before it did all of its goals, because part of that compromise was those bullet points there. Government was going to remove federal troops from the South. If you're removing your major enforcement, people are going to be a lot less likely to follow. It's the reason you see state police all over the highway. If we all drove the highways and knew the state police were never on the highway, we probably would drive whatever speed we wanted to, right? So it's the same sort of thing. When that force that was responsible for enacting and enforcing these new laws was removed. It removed a lot of the pressure from the South to actually follow them, and so problems arose from that as well. Um, Land grants, which Phil talked a little bit about, and we'll talk a little bit more about in this particular unit. We said that Southern officials would receive federal funds for construction and improvement projects. So we start to send some money down to build without expecting things in return. And then, yeah, the Democrats were like, yeah, no, no, do this and we'll totally respect all African American civil and political rights. Not necessarily how it went down in practice. So and then finally, now that we're back to the end of the war, we end with a video clip, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But in that video clip, asking students to think about what life was like for freed slaves after the war ended and what that clip said about how their lives changed during Reconstruction. Now, what is this video clip? The video clip is this, it's not this.
How to open your car door while submerged underwater.
Definitely not about this either.
In all recent
But what I can show you very quickly that they will not take down is this small opening portion to give you a great idea. It's a great clip from CBS Evening News about some of the lost stories of post-war America. Every time I watch this, I tear up a little bit. It is about soldiers, primarily Black soldiers, placing ads in papers, trying to find family members as they return to new and uncertain lives after the war. I'm just going to show this intro because that's about all I'm allowed to show as part of the recap. But it's a 3-minute video and you can have some great discussions with your kids on it.
Discovered documents tell a long forgotten story about American history. Here's Vladimir Duthier.
So right there, you got to see a little snippet of some of those documents appearing on the screen, but more is in the video itself. So definitely share this and show this with kids. So, all right. Let's see, where am I at now? So then we start to get into the Freedmen's Bureau, the Black Codes, and the rise of the KKK. So there's another video clip. There's lots of video clips in this, again, because we recognize that at this time of year, we may very well be trying to make up for lost time with students because testing may have gone over, your Civil War unit may have gone over. You are probably running out of time. You're probably measuring the days in single digit or in double digits. With at the best of times, maybe 20 days left by the time a lot of teachers make it to this unit. And more than likely, it could be closer to 10 or below. And that includes that final day that's always a field day. So we have included a lot of video clips to help you speed up some of this. But if you have the time, go deeper because some of these are so good. So there's a Freedmen's Bureau clip that was recently updated because the link was dead. Use the clip from David Shee as a starting activity and then have students visit, or if you're not one-to-one, the Freedmen's Bureau's website that's set up to learn more about what the Freedmen's Bureau accomplished. You can have them work in small groups to create some sort of poster or advertisement based on what's there, highlighting the mission of the Freedmen's Bureau, have them present and display those around the room. So what that looks like. This website also updated now because the original link went dead, but Nat Geo has done their own version of it. Really talks about, oh, that's not the right one. So there's the Freedmen's Bureau. I didn't pull that one up. More on what I just showed you in just a second. Always love it when the redirect notice doesn't take you there right off the bat, right? And it looks like I may have a CAPTCHA to solve before I go in. Checking connectivity. There we go. So this is a nice, but it is meaty. So again, this is one of the projects you might cut if you don't have the time and just show the videos. But this gets into, the beginning of the Bureau, what services it offered, how it tackled healthcare and land redistribution and all of this. You could assign students specific sections. You could run the whole thing through AI if you feel like it's at too high a Lexile. But for 8th graders, This one isn't so bad, but you're going to want to focus groups in certain places so that people aren't overwhelmed by thinking that they have to read the whole thing. But definitely have kids view this website and go through and start to talk a little bit more about and do a project that sort of brings to the forefront some of the major goals of the Freedmen's Bureau. So that is up here as well. Then there are a couple of video clips on the black codes that you can share from PBS. I did not take the time to load those in advance, so I'm not going to load them up here for you now. But definitely, and I can't show them to you anyway, because again, copyright notices. But there's a brief clip on the black codes from PBS. Show that to students and write the question on the board. So the interviewee in this video says this time period was really a conflict between independence and equality. What does she mean by this? And then watch the video and then talk about it with students. Give them some time to journal on it. Give them some time to talk to their neighbors and their peers a little bit about this. And then have a class discussion. And I think you'll be really surprised by some of the things that kids will take from this, because it's a very interesting video and very interesting process. So again, that question is, the interviewee in the video says this time period was really a conflict between independence and equality. What does she mean by that? So it's almost a compelling question in and of itself. Was this time period really a conflict between independence and equality? So give them a chance to sort out their thoughts and have a little discussion in class. So then we get to the Black Codes and Jim Crow, and there was originally a website at a different place that Nat Geo apparently took over, because this is the same thing, but it is not where it used to be. So I got that link corrected for anyone who was there on April 17th. I don't know how many people are at Reconstruction at April 17th in an 8th grade year, but if you did try to pull that up today, just know that I updated that link to its new home at Nat Geo. This is a really good overview for students to begin to learn a little bit more about what the codes look like. Just let them play on this page. What was it? And you can see stuff from beyond this era of US history as well. They can click into some of these things and learn a little bit more about voting rights, and again, the different constitutional amendments. And there are some related resources down at the bottom, but let them read a little bit about it and grapple with what all of this means. So you've got your colored water fountain and your white water fountain, and it's just, that is just not cool. And again, it's not until much later, it's not till almost 100 years later, that some of these things start to get resolved legislatively in the civil rights era that kids will learn about in high school. And then we've got a piece on the rise of the KKK. And it's not loading in my window right now, but I did jot some notes on this earlier. So you'll begin this part of the lesson by letting students know that they're going to be looking at some very sensitive, hard to view things. And then there are some brief videos from American Experience and Gilder Lehrman that go into depth on who the KKK were, and what their major aims and goals were. You're going to want to let students know that they're going to read and talk to the text from an 1868 letter from an anonymous KKK member to a Black elected official in Lincoln County, Georgia. Again, very sensitive topic. It's going to be really hard for some kids to read this and explore some of these resources. On the same note, it is very important that kids read about and learn about these things. It's not critical race theory. It's not indoctrination. It's cold, hard, simple fact, and we need to teach it. And the best way to teach without landing on the local news is to use primary sources to do it. So we give you this letter from an anonymous KKK letter to a Black elected official in Lincoln County, Georgia, in the hopes that kids will read it and be appalled and be uncomfortable, because this is a very uncomfortable period of our history, but it's not one that we can gloss over and just let go. Now, at the time that we're at, the KKK was still very new. And in the state elections of 1867 and 1868, many offices went to Republican candidates who were either African American or sympathetic to freedmen's rights. And this angered a lot of people. You could make some comparisons to things that have happened over the last 20 years in some cases, but this angered a lot of people. And by the summer of 1868, the Klan had sort of formalized and coalesced and come together, and they began attacking anyone that they viewed as their enemies. And at the end of 1868, the Freedmen's Bureau tallied almost 336 cases of murder or assault that were so severe as to constitute an assassination attempt, basically, committed against ex slaves. So, the Gilder Lehrman video and the resources that we share here that just aren't loading for me right now is a great lead into reading and talking about the talk to the text from Davy James, which is also included as part of this. And you can choose to do some deeper levels of questioning with it or do a talk to the text. Either one of those are a great opportunity to bring those in. Now, on a slightly more positive front, we have a project in here that, again, you can cut if you need to, but at the very least, give kids some time to explore some of this where we ask students to create a sort of tribute website. Everyone's pretty much one-to-one now, thanks to the pandemic. If there's a silver lining on a global pandemic, it's that every district was forced to figure out technology. So a lot of schools have Google Apps, and if you've got Google Apps, students have access to Google Sites and have them create a small website on a African American office holder from Reconstruction era. And before you're like, oh, Dave, I hate these kinds of projects because we send them loose on the internet to find out about somebody new and, good Lord, they go everywhere. We've linked you to a direct clickable list where you can start at least with Wikipedia on some of these people. So you've got Hiram Rhodes Revels, who is relatively he pops up in this as in these units as well a little bit later. But you can click in here and kids can start to get information and then they can go out and search a little bit further. So we at least give you the landing page of all of the elected officials. You can see there were 3 people elected to the US Senate. There was a whole slew elected to the House of Representatives during the Reconstruction era. Some of the not local, but some of the southern states, you can see all these people. Really, you don't have to get as in the weeds as the state legislatures unless you want to. Kids can just stay up top if that's where you want to go. Scrolling down the page so you can see that there really is a huge master list of these people, and anyone in red is someone that they do not have any information on, but even Michigan. So someone may want a Michigan connection. You had Joseph H. Dickinson, who was elected to the House of Representatives out of Wayne County in 1897. And before him, you had William Webb Ferguson, who was elected out of Wayne County in 1893. So they want to do some from Michigan. Michigan's listed. If you want to keep them more focused on just the House of Representatives in the US Senate, you can do that here. And you can obviously see what state that they're representing, right next to their name as well. So if you wanted to say only someone elected to the US House of Representatives from the Deep South, they can look at what states are part of the Deep South and pull up these people. And in a lot of cases, these people are going to have some of the stories we talked about in the previous part of the lesson. They're going to be the people that were often targeted by the KKK and some of these other groups. So give students at the very least time to create a pamphlet of some sort on their person or present their person to the class after they've had some time to do some research. If you've got time, have them actually develop kind of a tribute website. It's a great artifact that you can show to other classes as well, especially if you run out of time. So then we're going to get into the Reconstruction Amendments. And if you are, if you remember previous rollouts where I say pay attention to the number of tabs I have open, if you want to if you want to see where we're at. And so with the Reconstruction Amendments, we have this foldable activity that I'll get into in a minute. But basically, you're going to have them take the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment, to introduce those 3 amendments referred to as the Reconstruction Amendments. We've got another brief video clip from PBS. It's called Slavery by Another Name. And let students know that they're going to be picking apart the three amendments over the next several days, and they're going to try to pick out what things they've studied in this unit so far that may have been a reaction to some of these amendments. And then you're going to print out this foldable, and it's a front and back thing, so run both sides. The front is labeled interior fold, back and front, and they will work on this part last. The side with no labels is where they'll primarily be working for the next few days. Have them write the 13th Amendment in the first box and then read about that linked amendment. We've given you some text. You can use text that you've used yourself before. Have them read the linked amendment and then have them summarize the amendment and write and illustrate some of the things that they've studied so far that may have been reactions to the 13th Amendment. So it's one part regurgitation. Here's what the 13th Amendment was. And then it's also one part, okay, and here are some things that were probably reactions to the 13th Amendment. Now, always, on a project like this, you will have some lovely cherubs in your classroom who lose everything, even if you staple them to their foreheads. So, with those students, or maybe even with all of your students, collect the student work each day to redistribute back so that kids can't say, oh, I lost it. Because what generally happens there is, oh, I lost it. Okay, well, you're starting over. Yeah, that's not happening. And then you get into a power struggle, classroom management. So, take that out of the kids' hands and collect the work each day to redistribute back the next day. So then the second day, they're going to take a look at the 14th Amendment and they're going to look at the text of the 14th Amendment and they're going to pass out the foldables from the previous day. And then in the center, they're going to do the exact same thing. The unmarked columns, they're going to write 14th Amendment and they're going to do the same thing they did the previous day. They're going to summarize the major points. They're then going to either write and or illustrate, some of the reactions to this, and then you're going to collect them again. And on the third day, they're not resting. On the third day, the 15th Amendment is what you're going to take a look at. You're going to have students look at the text of the 15th Amendment. You're going to pass out the foldables again. And in the last unmarked column, you're going to have students write 15th Amendment, do the same thing from the previous days. They're going to summarize, they're going to write, they're going to illustrate. And then once completed, explain to students that what they've created is the inside of a brochure which illustrates the three Reconstruction amendments. Have them finish by creating a flashy cover on the cover flap, some small informational overview on the information flap, and then something on the back before folding it and handing it in. So this activity then becomes another artifact that you can share and use with students going forward. And again, the idea behind this is to really get kids to recognize the power of these three amendments and why they were passed, but also how these amendments sparked some deep divisions and deep reactions, particularly from Southerners. So that is it for me on this part of things. I'm going to turn things over to Phil now for Reconstruction in Maps. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to mute.
And this is a kind of odd positioning for this because, in fact, what it is a handful of maps, just like the Why the South Lost package was, that you can cut apart and use in different places there as just showing what was going on in Reconstruction. And we want to start out with a quick review of what they've already seen to say the South was indeed a unique region, environmentally, economically, and to some extent politically, right from the get-go, right from the time of the Constitution, right from the time when they were making the big compromises. I put in here 3 frames that you might use to summarize the Civil War itself from a population point of view. Because it's kind of important to note that the Union had roughly double the population. But when you count the number of free men between the ages of 18 and 45, roughly the working age population for that time period. Uh, the union was more like 5-1. That a substantial fraction of the 8,700 the 8,700,000 people in the Confederacy, half of them were slaves at the time. And the demographic profile, the population pyramid was a little bit different. Now that's important when you take a look at how many people served in the actual Civil War in one form or another. For the Union, it was basically a little bit less than 1/3 of the free white men at the time. For the Confederacy, it was substantially more than half. Now, that number becomes especially important when you realize that only about a quarter of the people who served, less than a quarter of the people who served, were killed from the Union, but more than half of the people that served in the Confederate Army were killed. And less than 1/5 were wounded, as opposed to more than it. And if you take a look at that whole package of numbers there, and you look at that, and then you've got to ask the question, when we're going into Reconstruction, what is Reconstruction going to be like when you have had more than half of your working age population, the free white population, serving in a war, half of them were killed and a quarter of them were wounded? This takes a great big chunk out of your working population when it comes time to talk about Reconstruction. That shows up in a lot of other maps that you can use. A map of manufacturing shows that manufacturing was basically a northern and to some extent even becoming a western phenomenon, whereas agriculture was the dominant activity in the South all the way up to 1890 and beyond. If you compare the railroads in 1880, because this is how you get products to market, the railroad pattern was every little town had a railroad in the North. In the South, railroads were really quite few and far between. If you compare immigration in 1880, very few immigrants wanted to move to the South. With the poor soil, terrible transportation, shortage of factory jobs, and yellow fever, and hookworm, and a lot of war damage. You can see that when you compare the population growth of individual states at that time, states that were about the same size in 1800, but Ohio growing to be up around 4 million people, and South Carolina making it barely past 1 million. Or Michigan and Mississippi. Again, about the same size in the early 1800s, but Michigan over 2 million people and Mississippi barely 1 million. Another map that you might find useful at some point in your discussions here is just a map of the value of property. Now, this is a map that was done in 1890, because property is not just a measure of personal wealth. It's also a measure of the tax base that you can use to build roads, to support schools, to run governments, to have welfare programs. So it wasn't just that the people in the South were left with a considerable amount of poverty as a result of the war, but that poverty compounded on itself to make government and construction a whole lot more difficult. If you compare the religions in 1890, it's practically the identical map that you would have today if you knew the map of it. And if you carry any one of these ideas on into the present day, here's a map of life expectancy in 2020. And the red areas are where you basically 5 years left life expectancy, and it's almost exactly that map of those infertile red soils that led to so many other problems. Or here's a map of people who completed high school in 1950, and the bottom map in the year 2000. And in each one of them, you can pick out that southern region so that educational levels have basically not been reconstructed yet. It's not reached back. Now, the 2000 map does show some of the cities in the South have gotten up to northern levels of education, but large areas of the South are still relatively less educated. And to show how the can just kept getting kicked down the road, here's a map of the state laws about school segregation in 1950. All of those red areas, school segregation was required by state law as recently as 1950. Prohibited in the north, no law at all in parts of the Great Plains, and optional out in that pivot state of Kansas and in the desert Southwest. So that's just a handful of maps that you can plug in or out as you see fit in these other discussions when you want to break up the discussion. Or you might even have what we call a map of the day, where you have the map at the beginning of it, have people talk a little bit about it, and then go on into the activity. The KKK fell into fertile ground when it became one of the mechanisms of transmitting information in a region that had a very poor school system. That these things are related, and to show those connections, to say that Reconstruction was not the kind of problem that you can address by solving one little problem at a time, because it was a system problem. It was a number of things that were related to each other. And that's what we've been trying to say with these maps all along. So with that, I will do the stop share thing. Pass this back to Davey, because it says you're talking about assessment now.
And then I'm going to talk a little bit about that final assessment. And so, like all of our assessments, these are in draft form, and you're going to take them and you're going to do what you're going to do with them. Whether that is use them completely verbatim, or whether that is changing them up or doing something different with them in some way, shape, or form. But just remember, these all exist in Google Drive, but you don't have physical access to them unless I have shared them with you directly, or unless you've copied down the link from our agenda. So if you are viewing these in the future, make sure that you reach out to me at my email address if you need these, because they are a really good starting point. You can see we've got one for unit 0 and 1 that go together. We've got one for unit 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and all the way up to 7. So these are all in a Google slide deck format, because again, if you decide to give these to students and you decide to do them virtually, you can use Google Classroom to share a copy with everybody and they can do their work in line. But these also print relatively nicely, so you could choose to go that route as well if you still wanted to do paper pencil. So this particular assessment has a grand total of 23 questions on it. And you're like, Dave, that sounds a little short. But again, so is our unit. And if you haven't been looking at these assessments along the way, these are pretty rigorous. So we'll start off by taking again a look at the reconstruction plans. And what we want kids to do here, this is one part recall, one part synthesis. What we want kids to do here is basically use their knowledge of Reconstruction. And if they remember everything about this, then this part becomes a really easy lift. But some of your students may not have been there that day, or, 3 or 4 important things may have happened to them between the day that you talked about the different Reconstruction plans and when you get to the assessment. So we give them the gist, but we don't flat out give them the answer. We give them the gist here. They can take a look at it and then they can decide, you know what, this was part of Lincoln's plan, or this was part of both plans, or this was part of Johnson's plan. And all they're going to do is hover their mouse till you see that little arrow thing, and they're just going to move things to the correct boxes. And I'm immediately going to hit my Control Z or my Command Z on my Mac here so that that goes back to the exact spot I had it. So these are the first 6 questions of this particular assessment. So out of 23, 6 of them are listed right here on the first page because each one of these is a point. Then we get into a multiple choice question. So in this case, again, we've got the radical Republican Reconstruction Plan, and students will choose from the following options. And when they know what answer they want, they're just going to click in the box and they're going to type their answer. Answer choice Z in this case is very clearly the correct one. Getting to this one, it is a extended response question. So in this particular case, we're being very careful with the wording here. It's not a good idea to do a scenario-based prompt on slavery where you ask them to picture their lives as a slave and write about that. What we're trying to do here is get kids to think about what they've learned about life for African Americans in the South. And we want them in this case to decide which plan would be of best benefit for you. So in this case, the difference between those 2 assignments is here we're asking them to use some history-based factual knowledge and say, I think this may have been the best plan for African American slave or enslaved peoples who are newly freed overall. So it's a very different prompt from some of the ones that sometimes gets teachers in trouble. Question 9 gets into differences between the Freedmen's Bureau policies and restrictions. So basically, we're asking kids here, this is more of a recall based question. We're asking kids here to go, okay, which of these were Freedmen's Bureau policies? And then which of these were restrictions that were placed on Freedmen's Bureaus or reactions to Freedmen's Bureaus that happened in the South? So again, this is like that first question. Students are going to drag each of these markers into the appropriate column. And each one of these is going to be worth a point. So right now you've seen up to 14 points available for this question or for this particular assessment. Then I always love doing some document studies. So we have 2 multiple choice questions here that are part of this particular drawing that is on the page. And here, this one is a very high resolution image. So if need be, students can zoom in and you're not going to lose out on the quality. And it's, again, an activator. So it's doing something similar to what the M-Step is currently doing this year, where they are. Phil, can you still see my whole screen?
Mhm. Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure because I just made it bigger on my end and I don't know what that does to it on your end. So the M step this year is introducing something that's called a context based item set. And I don't love it. We tried to employ this just a little bit differently, where we provide the content, we provide this for context, but we're also asking kids to do something with it. The new M step is not asking kids to do something with it. It's just provided there for context. So both of these questions, the picture provides both context and some of the information that students will need to answer the question. We then get into a writing prompt, and this is one of our most simple but powerful writing prompts across all of the Giants assessments. Why is this picture significant? This picture is significant for a lot of reasons. And part of it's right there in the title, the first colored senator and representatives in the 41st and 42nd Congress of the United States. So that's something I would expect to see as an answer to this. But I want kids to go deeper and also talk a little bit more about how, if these are the first, it means that there are 7 of them.
Girls, we're leaving soon. Make sure you're ready.
We have Apple iPods in our house, or Apple AirPod, HomePods in our house, and there's an intercom feature. And so as soon as I heard the ding, I stopped talking because I didn't want to talk over my wife announcing that it's time to leave for dance class. But so basically, the significance of this picture is multifaceted. It's not just the title of this photo that's here. I would also expect a answer that receives full points to talk a little bit about how their lives could have been threatened. They probably knew that their lives could have been threatened when they signed up to run, but they did it anyway because of the importance of it. So that's part of the significance of this picture. We then get into another writing prompt. Using the picture on this page and your knowledge of history, explain Southern resistance to the freedom of African Americans in the Civil War. So again, here's a prompt that will hopefully get kids started, but then I want that prompt to not just get things started, but move forward and start to talk about really the effect of the KKK, in the South, because gosh, I really don't want anyone in the year of our Lord 2024 to walk away thinking that maybe some of the KKK were really good people. They weren't. Look at what they're doing in this picture. Look at what you learned in this particular unit. So I would hope that kids would get into a discussion of that in this prompt as well. Then we get into analyzing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Kids, again, may have done this partially back in your Constitution unit early on in the year. They're going to do it here now in context. And now they understand more about why the 13th Amendment was passed, why the 14th Amendment was passed, why the 15th Amendment was passed, why these amendments were so important and so big. And I want them to analyze what effect those had on society after the Civil War. They had some good effects, but as we learned and talked about in the Unit 7 overview a good 35, 40 minutes ago, they also, they also had some unintended side effects. So I would expect to see kids write a little bit about some of those as well. Then we've got this beautiful map from 1876, and we're starting to look at the electoral votes of the election of 1876. And we talk a little bit about how, under the terms of the agreement in the election of 1876, Democrats agreed to accept the Republican presidential electors, thus assuring that Rutherford B. Hayes would become the next president, provided Republicans would agree to withdraw federal soldiers from the remaining places in the South. This is how the electoral map shook down. Explain why each party agreed to the outcome of the election. So the map is an activator, but it's also a clue, and you get to see where the support for all of these people were. Smart kids are going to start to total up some of the electoral votes and look at the popular vote as well, and they're going to go, this was a lot closer. But then they're also going to bring their knowledge of history back into this as well, and that's important. And then the final question, which gets into questions 21, 22, and 23, we have 3 quotes from 3 different people. We learn a little bit about some of these people in the Giants units, but we want kids to, just like before, sort these quotes to the right person who said it. So in this particular case, they're going to drag each quote to the appropriate thought bubble. The thought bubble is too big or is too small for all of them, but it's totally fine. You're going to see them in the correct order, ideally, when kids get those. So the Unit 7 assessment follows suit with all of the others. It's a pretty in-depth dive into the major concepts from this particular unit. But it is a draft. I did send these out last year for some teachers to pilot and give me feedback, and they happily accepted the draft assessments, but gave me no feedback in return. I like to think that that means all of these assessments were so well put together that they couldn't think of a single piece of feedback that might have made them any better. However, Phil and I have been working together for a very long time, and we've even offered money for feedback on some of our projects and not been able to get it. So I'm assuming, though, overall, they served the purpose and teachers took them and adapted them to their specific needs. And if they didn't, I assume that they probably would have contacted me because we all know, right? Like most of the time, people, if they have a good view of something, they're not going to go out of their way to tell people, hey, thanks for this cool thing. But if they're mad, they get all over the internet and they will tell anyone who will listen to them how bad insert name of thing here was. And all you have to do is really read the Amazon reviews on a couple of products to see that that's generally the case. So I'm assuming they're good, but they're as open source as the rest of the units. So take them and adapt them to your individual needs, whatever those individual needs might be. Because they're free and they're freely available to you. And that was another one of the major value adds of doing these rollouts this year, because these assessments did not exist when we did this the first time around. So this makes things a little more robust. Overall, I want to pull up one image for you very quickly here. Da, da, da. And I realize I'm not sharing my screen. I will do that right now. If you go back and if you think back to the very first night that we were together doing these rollouts and I brought up the pacing view, you can see that our pacing view takes us all the way through a 36-week school year. Some of these units are designed to be a little bit bigger because they encompass testing. Unit 6 and 7, I would say a chunk of maybe 3 or 4 weeks in here might end up getting dedicated to testing. Always prioritize the Civil War over Reconstruction because the big things that pop up on the M step tend to be those 3 Reconstruction amendments. And if you followed our course of study, somewhere in weeks 6 through 12, we already talked about those Reconstruction amendments as part of our normal lesson and our study of the Constitution. So don't jip yourself on the Civil War just because you see 6 weeks here for Reconstruction. We expect people are going to cut Reconstruction a little bit shorter than they want to because in a normal year, not this year, we didn't really have a winter this year, but in a normal year, snow days, extra things, assemblies, fire drills, all of these things end up taking away valuable instructional time. The Civil War, from the 2 units that we've rolled out over the last 2, the Civil War is the most important part. Reconstruction is equally important, but we very intentionally built Unit 7 as a if then. So if you don't have time to delve deeply into some of the projects, at the very least, have the discussions, show the video clips, do the brief readings, and move on from there. Phil, anything else you want to say about 8th grade Giants overall?
Not really. Had fun doing.
What Phil is thinking is close enough for government work, right?
Hey,
I'm just kidding. So, this year has been a blast. We've had light attendance at most of these, but for those of you who tuned in for some of them or are watching the recaps later, we hope you find these units valuable. And if you do have suggestions, feel free to reach out to either one of us. We would be more than happy to take them under consideration. We want these to live on as long as they can live. And to do that, we need to update links if they go dead. We need to update assignments if they're no longer appropriate for use in the classroom. So if you have feedback on any of these units, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. And if you're in need of the assessments and you're viewing this later and you weren't part of the networks to receive the agenda, all you need to do is email david.johnson@wmisd.org. And as soon as I verify that you're a teacher by looking your picture up on your school website so that a kid doesn't spoof an email address, I will send you access to all of the assessments and you can have those as well. It has been an absolute honor working with all of you guys this year. Next year, Phil and I get to pause and just co-facilitate while Phil's lovely wife and a 4th grade teacher handle 4th grade. So Phil and I will have our own little private back channels through those evenings, as many of you have probably had during our evenings. So have a great rest of your school year. The best wish that I can give to any teacher, especially this time of year, is I wish you a boring, uneventful rest of your school year. So have a great night, and we will see you soon.